Griftlands is a roguelike deck building game that I was excited to play back when it was announced, but then it was released on early access in 2019, which meant I wasn't really gonna touch it until it had a full release, which was this year in June. And as I tried to go pretty blind into these games outside of the initial trailer, I was very surprised to what kind of game this ended up being. I thought this would be just a fun little deck building game where you add new and more powerful cards in a more increasingly difficult game, and while there is aspects of that, I was surprised how story focused this game was, which is not often the focus of any roguelikes at all. So let's get into it with the said story. This game has 3 campaigns focusing on 3 different characters in 3 different locations in this very otherworldly sci-fi setting, and basically through some way or another your character will end up being a bounty hunter, which allows for a lot of the choices that the game wants to put you up to. As the start of the game kinda just sets the setting, it gives you an idea of how the mechanics work, which we'll go more in depth into in the gameplay of course, but basically you can be liked or disliked by people depending on your actions, and because of that you can't please everyone. Inevitably you'll find yourself having to align to a certain group or faction, and your story will build around that, as following a group might lead you to an ending while another group might lead you to another set of endings. That being said, while there is a lot of paths you can take, the journey is all but too similar, resting on the characters and lore to push it through in the replays, as while you will be taking different paths, the gameplay is fundamentally the same, and the length will also be very similar, as every story takes the same 4 in-game days and they usually end at around the same place, even if you take a completely different route. So there is a lot of variety at face value, but it is almost like an illusion, and that illusion is broken very easily once you play through the game a couple of times. That being said, it's still very enjoyable, especially the first time around, and creating friends and enemies is a really nice mechanically, especially since it does affect the gameplay as well in various different ways. And so let's get into that with the gameplay. Being a roguelike, it is a game where once you die you have to restart, but I will say that as far as roguelikes go, even on the regular difficulty, this is not particularly the hardest roguelike. And even if you are not particularly fond of roguelikes or just aren't very good at it, then there is still an easy mode that they labeled as being to experience the story and not worry about the gameplay. And on the other side of the coin, there is Brawl, which is only unlocked after beating the story, where it ignores the story and focuses on the combat. And in terms of combat, there are actually 2 types of it in this game. There are the regular fighting, where you use cards to determine your character actions, much like in a turn-based RPG, with a very similar playstyle to Slay the Spire or Hearthstone, where each turn you have an amount of energy you can expand with, of course, each card costing a certain amount of it. Cards that add defense or cards that attack or add some kind of effect like power, which raises the power of your attack, or bleeding, which does what bleeding does in every RPG, basically making the character suffering from it take periodic damage while it lasts. And it is very basic here. I would say it's probably one of the weakest bits of the gameplay, that there just isn't any gimmick or interesting mechanic to change the pace up. It's just slower and more simple than its contemporaries like Slay the Spire, which I already mentioned, only really allowing you to do any kind of complex combos very late in the game. And also by that point you don't get to use them much because the story is rather short. I think where this game is a bit more unique, it's in its second type of combat, the arguments. And while it might sound eyebrow raising at first, it really works in the same basis, as at the end of the day the objective will be to lower your enemies' argument life bar to 0. What makes it interesting here is how you go about that, of course, and especially with the first character, it will be once again very similar to the regular fights, using cards that create attacks and defense, things like that. What makes it more interesting here is the arguments and sub-arguments that comprise the battles, as these sub-arguments also have health bars and their own abilities, and a big part of it will be almost like creating a good team that can attack and defend your argument. Continuous defense here being an important thing, as one of the things about this game in both types of fights that is not continuous is the shields being temporary, basically, as they only last the turn that they are added, meaning you can't really stack them over turns to create a strong defense. To compensate for this, then the game has a fairly big health bar for each type of combat, which also adds up to some of the decisions you make in this game, which we'll talk more about in a bit. But getting back to it once again, the problem with this type of argument fights is, once again, there just isn't enough going for it early on, and by the time there is, the game is almost over. And it's not a question of it being easy or hard, as difficulty here is very much dictated by the enemy's health bar, at least on the argument side. On the battle side, each character aside from you has a star rating that tells you how hard it would be to fight them, and of course, generally speaking, as you progress through the game, the higher just everyone's difficulty gets. Now, while the core of the gameplay can feel very simple for most of it, I do think that the things around it end up propping it up quite a lot with how they actively affect the gameplay or how they make you perceive it. For example, on the more active side, if you get the character to love you, which is the step above them liking you, then you get some form of gameplay buff relating to them. And on the opposite side, if a character hates you, you'll get a debuff. Another active thing relating to party members, which here, with some exceptions, are mostly temporary, and while they are mostly there for combat, they also help in arguments, adding an additional buff or sub-argument, with the idea being like this character would vouch for you, or having this character with you would be intimidating, which I think is a really cool way of gamifying that idea. And I think that in that way this game really succeeded, in a way that the plot leaks into the gameplay, making for something that should feel separate, this concept of turn-based card game, but because of this, feeling a lot more connected. Continuing then now with the more indirect ways, with probably one of the most important ones, is when it comes to making decisions at certain points where you can choose to fight or talk it out, and that of course affecting how characters will perceive you. But there is more to take into consideration. Some characters might just be hard to talk with, and violence is simply the easier path. Sometimes talking doesn't even resolve the issue, especially for bosses, where it really only serves to weaken your enemy and not so much avoid the fight altogether. So it is a situation where you can really just focus on one type of fighting. Also, something to say here is that when you lose an argument, you still live, but if you lose in combat, you die. That being important, of course, because of the roguelike element. And it's also clear that the intent of the game is to keep you with both decks usable, especially as your health does not replenish after you fight, so you can find yourself in a situation where one of your health bars is just a bit too low, making you a lot more compelling to use the other method. And once again, the gameplay is aware of the focus on this, given even though the best way to strengthen your deck is to use it, but even when not using it, the cards will still level up after a combat of the opposite type for whatever reason, and you will get many opportunities to gain or remove cards throughout the game, which is a big deal in this keep adding cards to your deck type of game. But now that you have a general idea of the game and its mechanics, let's talk about how these mechanics come about and how you end up having multiple paths beside the obvious choices. Well, for starters, we have this sort of open world map where you can click where you want to go, and many a times there will be multiple quests you can choose from, and doing a quest will pass time in the world, and so given you have 4 days in game time, you can only do certain quests, and of course this will take you on a certain path. And these paths having its own branches where maybe conflict between characters in the story happen, and you have a choice to pick sides. And this is a compelling way of having you replay the game to see the other paths, but because the changes can often be so minimal and the gameplay itself isn't the most engaging, I personally could not see myself replaying this game much more than what I did for this review. That's not to say I did not enjoy my time with it, but because I just don't see myself wishing to replay it anytime soon. Now, other things you can do in these maps Well, there are different maps, but these are really just skins at the end of the day, with different characters as well, as each one will still have the same base locations where you can do, for example, hire people to be in your party for a day, or a store where you can buy and remove cards or upgrade some of your enhancements, which I didn't bother going deep into because they're just small upgrades, with the stronger ones usually making you strong in one way but weaker in another, so you just got to choose them based on your current build and what you're trying to do. And then we have a main bar where you can replenish your health and also sleep from day to day, which, by the way, you just regen all your health from day to day, so don't waste your money eating before bed, unless there is a boss that's going to show up in your room, which is a bit of an annoying little thing that mostly only happens to our first main character. Also, another thing to add to the sleep though is that all of the cards that I call bloat cards will be burned off, as when you eat or drink, you can also drink with certain characters for health and also to make them like you. You can pay to make them love you, which is an interesting mechanic. I guess that the only way that makes sense is because of the buffs they give you, but from the story standpoint it is weird regardless. But getting back to it, when you consume these things in the game, you will receive these cards that have no use but will be inserted into your deck, and the only ways to get rid of them are, well, you can pay to get rid of them like you would with other cards, which is a bit of a waste of money, or use them during gameplay, which will cost energy, which is precious during a turn, but you only have to do it once since the card will be burned after. Or with the one I already mentioned, you can just put up with it and wait until the day is over, where they will get automatically burned when you transition from day to day. Now, something else I thought it was important to mention about the gameplay is the random encounters. Sometimes when going from place to place, you might be stalked by one of these encounters, and these are pretty cool since they can give you really good upgrades or even party members, like the permanent party member that are the pets, at least if they don't die, which was the final thing I wanted to really talk about the game, is the death system. As characters here, when they die for good, either on your team or the adversary. This working with the surrender mechanic, where if a character is under a certain amount of health, they will surrender, and you can choose to spare them or to kill them either way, which of course, when taking that decision, will have impact on other characters that are related to them, and it will also affect your reputation, and once again that affecting the path you take in the story, which is pretty cool. The thing with pets here is that they usually will run away once they get to that surrender state, meaning that it's actually quite hard to kill a pet, thankfully, and once they run away from combat, you will most likely find them again through another random encounter, and choose if you want to add them back. But the important thing about this mechanic is really what I mentioned, with it affecting the story and relationships, especially since sometimes you might accidentally kill an enemy, or an enemy just won't surrender and only fight to the death, and that adding to it, because of course this only happens in the combat section and not the arguments, as you can't really give anyone an aneurysm. Then overall the gameplay is alright. The card game is not very deep, even with the later characters, which do add some variety with their unique cards, but the game around it does make it a lot more interesting and, in a way, more in depth, and overall I did still enjoy my journey through all the stories. Now, moving on to the graphics, this is a game mostly made out of drawn art, and it looks nice. It is very cartoony, with a sci-fi look. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if this was like a show on Adult Swim, except for the fact it's not full of potty and overly sexual jokes. Yeah, I'm using this video to call out Adult Swim. No, I'm just kidding. But anyways, the backgrounds and the map itself are also very nice, keeping with the feeling of being a very alien place with also its diverse society and locations. It's not a sci-fi world if there is no poor area with neon lights and shady characters, and rich area with very clean aesthetic and posh aliens. Which is not a critique of the setting, just a bit of a funny thing that so many sci-fi settings use this as a setup. It looks great either way, I'm gonna say it. Moving on then to the soundtrack, though, it is fine. It fits once again with the aesthetic of the whole thing, but it's nothing amazing. Like, how should I put it? It works as background music for a card game. It never gets too over the top or too calm, but I'll be honest, if I were to play this game more, I would end up doing the same thing I do with games like Slay the Spire, where I just play my own playlist of music, even despite this game's bigger focus on story. But overall, while this is a really good game, I just don't see myself doing that, because I don't see myself really coming back to it. I mean, not because it's bad, but because despite having a lot going for, its core gameplay is just not deep or varied enough to entertain me in the long run, and I think I've made that pretty clear. And for that, I am giving Griftlands a 7 out of 10. It's good, and recommendations wise, I would recommend it to anyone that enjoys this card game roguelikes, as it is unique in that medium while still having a level of familiarity that would make it easier to jump into it if you're coming from something like, the already mentioned Slay the Spire. But if you do, also be aware that this will be a slower game. Now, price-wise, it's hard to argue when it sells for less than $20, even when not on sale, so if you like this genre of game, then give it a shot. And if you never try this type of game, then this is actually not a bad one to start with, because of how simple it is and how easy it is compared to other games in the genre. And while it's not the most raw experience, it might be good for a first timer who would maybe usually prefer their games to have a focus on story. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking and even commenting, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.